Karen slaps child 4 staring at her too long, didn't realize he's legally blind. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story don't forget to subscribe. The grocery store buzzed with the usual mid-afternoon crowd, a steady hum of conversation, the rustle of plastic bags, and the beeping of barcode scanners filling the air as customers queued patiently at the checkout lines. It was a weekday lull before the after-work rush, and shoppers moved slowly but deliberately, mentally ticking off their lists and preparing for the weekend ahead. Among the sea of faces and cartwheels rolling over worn linoleum floors, Karen stood out, though not for any pleasant reason. Her sharp eyes darted around nervously, her lips pressed into a thin line as she held tightly onto the handle of her shopping cart filled with carefully selected groceries. She seemed tense, agitated, the kind of person whose patience wore thin and whose irritation was easy to ignite. Today, for reasons unclear even to herself, she was particularly on edge, sensitive to every little sound or glance that might cross her path. Karen chose a checkout lane that was neither the shortest nor the longest, standing a few feet ahead of a young boy waiting in line with his mother. The boy looked to be about 7 or 8 years old, with curly hair and an innocent face that held the wide-eyed curiosity of a child exploring the world. He held tightly to his mother's hand, his other hand clutching a small backpack, and though his eyes moved slowly and without the sharp focus of a typical child his age, his expression was one of quiet attentiveness. Karen's gaze, however, soon settled on the boy with a growing sense of unease that she couldn't quite shake. It wasn't just that he was behind her, there was something about the way he looked in her direction, a sensation that quickly morphed into an accusation in her mind. To Karen, the boy wasn't just looking, he was glaring, staring, fixing her with a look that felt loaded with challenge and disrespect. As the line inched forward and customers shuffled impatiently, Karen's irritation bubbled beneath the surface. The boy's gaze felt increasingly heavy on her back, though in reality, he was simply watching the world around him with the slow, deliberate movements typical of someone adjusting to a visual impairment. But Karen didn't know this. All she knew was that this child was acting rude, that he was somehow confronting her with his eyes, and that she was entitled to demand respect in her personal space. She muttered under her breath about the lack of discipline in children these days, about how parents failed to teach their kids manners, and about how she was sick of being subjected to such blatant disregard. Her voice grew louder with each passing minute, her complaints now audible enough to draw a few curious glances from fellow shoppers nearby, who exchanged uncertain looks but mostly kept their distance. The boy remained quiet, sensing the tension but unsure of what was being directed at him. His mother, standing a few paces behind, tried to soothe his apparent discomfort, whispering gentle reassurances and lightly squeezing his hand. She was well aware of her son's challenges, knowing that his limited vision made navigating crowded places difficult and often frightening. To her, the bustling grocery store was a minefield of obstacles and noises, but they made their way with care and patience. She hadn't noticed Karen's growing agitation until it became impossible to ignore, and a knot of worry formed in her stomach as she saw the woman's eyes fixated so intently on her son. Something about Karen's demeanor was off, too sharp, too accusatory, and far too reactive. Karen's mind raced, fueled by her growing paranoia and a need to assert control over what she perceived as a threat. Every glance from the boy felt like a challenge to her authority, a violation of her dignity, and she found herself preparing to confront him, to put an end to what she believed was unacceptable behavior. The murmurs around her grew louder, a background chorus of whispered questions and concerned observations, but Karen was too wrapped up in her own narrative to notice. The boy, meanwhile, shifted uneasily on his feet, his face registering confusion and a hint of fear as Karen's gaze sharpened and her posture stiffened. Suddenly, Karen spun around with a sharp motion, her voice cutting through the ambient noise like a whistle. "Hey! What do you think you're looking at? Stop glaring at me like that." The boy's eyes widened, and he took a hesitant step back, unsure how to respond to the sudden accusation. His mother immediately moved forward, her voice steady but firm as she intervened. "Please, ma'am, my son can't see very well. He's legally blind." He wasn't glaring at anyone. But Karen was already past reason, her anger flaring unchecked. The years of pent-up frustration, the stress of the day, and her deep-seated intolerance for what she perceived as disrespect exploded all at once. Before anyone could stop her, Karen reached out and slapped the boy across the cheek, a sharp sound ringing through the checkout aisle that silenced the chatter and froze the crowd. Gasps erupted from the nearby shoppers, some clutching their carts in shock, others stepping forward to protest the sudden violence. The boy's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes, both from shock and the sting of seeing her child hurt. The boy's small frame recoiled, and for a moment, the entire checkout line seemed suspended in disbelief and horror. Karen, chest heaving and eyes blazing, seemed momentarily stunned by her own action, as if the slap had broken through her fury and forced her to confront what she had just done. The mother's voice rose, a mixture of anguish and anger as she demanded an explanation, her words cutting through the stunned silence. "How could you hit a child? He can't see. He didn't do anything wrong." Several shoppers began to rally around the mother and child, their expressions hardening toward Karen as whispers turned to loud admonishments. "That's a kid, not a threat. You don't hit children. What's wrong with you?" The store manager hurried over, alerted by the commotion, trying to calm the situation but also preparing to call the police if necessary. Karen's eyes darted around, sensing the shifting tide of opinion and feeling the weight of judgment bearing down on her like a physical force. Her anger deflated somewhat, replaced by a mixture of embarrassment and defiance, but the damage was done. The mother held her son protectively, explaining gently to those around them what it meant to be legally blind and how such children experienced the world differently, often misunderstood and unfairly judged. The police were called, and as Karen stood amidst the stunned crowd, the reality of her actions began to settle heavily upon her. What had started as a perceived slight had escalated beyond a simple misunderstanding, becoming a moment of violence against a vulnerable child. The grocery store checkout line, once just a place of routine errands and idle waiting, had become a crucible of tension and pain, where patience was tested and humanity challenged. Karen's world, shaped by anger and impatience, was on the verge of unraveling as the consequences of her impulsive choice loomed large. The moment the sharp sound of the slap echoed through the checkout line, a wave of stunned silence spread across the grocery store aisle, as if time itself had momentarily frozen in shock at the sudden violence inflicted upon a child who had done nothing wrong. The boy's eyes welled with tears, his small face a mixture of confusion, hurt, and fear, while his mother's protective instincts surged forward as she immediately crouched beside him, wrapping her arms around his trembling frame and murmuring soothing words meant to comfort but unable to completely erase the shock that had settled on all nearby. The other shoppers, who had moments ago been simply waiting their turn or glancing about the store, now found themselves involuntarily drawn into a scene they would not soon forget, a confrontation fueled by misunderstanding, prejudice, and unchecked anger that had erupted into physical harm. Karen, meanwhile, stood rigid and breathless, the initial surge of rage that had driven her action dissipating, replaced by a sudden, cold realization of what she had done and the irreversible consequences now facing her. The mother's voice, though shaking with emotion, grew firm and resolute as she addressed Karen and the surrounding crowd, explaining in clear and compassionate terms the reality of her son's condition. "He is legally blind," she said, her eyes never leaving her child's tear-streaked face. "He cannot see properly, and what you thought was a glare was actually his attempt to focus on the world around him. He is not being rude or disrespectful. Please understand that this is not his fault." Her words hung heavily in the air, softening some of the harsh judgments but also exposing the harsh truth of Karen's ignorance and the dangers of assuming ill intent based on appearances. The boy clung to his mother's hand, still trembling but finding a measure of solace in her presence, as other customers nodded solemnly, some reaching out with quiet words of support or gentle gestures of empathy. The grocery store manager hurried over, his expression a mix of concern and authority as he quickly assessed the escalating situation. His first priority was to ensure the safety and well-being of the child, signaling to another employee to fetch a first aid kit in case any physical care was needed. At the same time, he began speaking to Karen in a measured tone, trying to diffuse her defensive posture and impress upon her the seriousness of what had just occurred. "Ma'am, this kind of behavior is unacceptable," he said firmly. "Hitting a child, regardless of the circumstances, is not tolerated here. We will have to involve the authorities to properly address this incident." Karen's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation as she tried to compose herself, her mind racing to formulate a defense or justification, but the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on her. Several other shoppers began to voice their outrage, expressing disbelief that someone would resort to violence against a child, especially one who was clearly vulnerable. "How could you do that?" one woman exclaimed, her voice trembling with anger. "He didn't even know what was happening. He can't see you the way you think he can." Another man added, "People need to learn patience, especially with kids who have challenges. You had no right." The collective disapproval was palpable, and Karen found herself shrinking under the weight of judgment, her earlier bravado replaced by a sense of isolation and regret. The realization that she had not only hurt an innocent child but had also drawn public condemnation began to dawn with uncomfortable clarity. As tension mounted, a call was placed to the local police department to report the assault. The mother insisted on involving the authorities, not out of a desire for retribution but to ensure that such an incident was formally documented and that her son's rights and safety were protected. The police dispatcher promised to send officers immediately and advised the manager and those involved to remain calm and cooperative until help arrived. Karen, now noticeably shaken, tried to explain herself through a mix of stammering and defensive remarks, insisting that the child had been disrespectful and that she had only reacted out of self-defense. Her words fell flat in the face of mounting evidence and the testimonies of witnesses who had observed her aggressive behavior escalate without provocation. When the police officers arrived, their presence brought a solemn seriousness to the scene. They moved with professionalism and care, immediately focusing their attention on the child and his mother to assess his condition and provide reassurance. The mother explained once again her son's condition, emphasizing the importance of understanding and patience when interacting with children who faced unique challenges. The officers listened attentively, nodding in acknowledgement and expressing sympathy for the distress caused by the incident. They also spoke privately with Karen, giving her an opportunity to recount her perspective while gently but firmly reminding her of the legal implications of assault, especially against a minor. Karen's demeanor shifted from defiance to remorse as the officers explained the process that would follow. They informed her that a formal complaint had been lodged, and she would likely face charges related to child abuse or assault. They also explained that the welfare of the child was paramount and that they would be ensuring he received any necessary support and protection. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on Karen, her earlier justification crumbling as she came to terms with the fact that her actions had real, serious consequences. Witnesses who had seen the incident offered statements, reinforcing the mother's account and painting a picture of a woman whose anger had escalated without cause. As the officers wrapped up their investigation, the mother gently helped her son to his feet, whispering comforting words and promising him that they were safe now. She addressed the small crowd that had gathered, educating them about legal blindness and the importance of empathy and patience. Her calm explanation helped many to better understand the boy's behavior and the reasons why Karen's reaction had been so misguided and harmful. The community's response shifted from shock to support, with many expressing a desire to advocate for greater awareness of disabilities and for kindness in moments of misunderstanding. Karen remained standing nearby, a mixture of shame and contemplation on her face. The incident had stripped away her certainty and exposed vulnerabilities she had long ignored. The grocery store checkout line, once a place of mundane routine, had become a stage for a painful lesson in compassion and the dangers of jumping to conclusions. The echoes of the slap still lingered in the air, a stark reminder that anger left unchecked could cause irreparable harm. And as the police prepared to escort the family and finalize the necessary procedures, Karen was left alone to face the consequences of a moment she would never forget and to reckon with the changes she would need to make within herself if she hoped to heal and grow from this experience. The arrival of the police officers marked a shift in the atmosphere, transforming the grocery store aisle from a site of raw confrontation into a formal setting of inquiry and consequence, where the repercussions of Karen's impulsive action would begin to take shape with the sober weight of legal reality. The officers, composed and professional, immediately focused their attention on the child and his mother, showing care and understanding as they gently asked questions about the boy's well-being. carefully assessing whether the slap had caused any physical harm beyond the visible shock and tears. The mother, protective and composed despite the distress, explained her son's condition, how he was legally blind and how this affected his ability to interpret visual cues, often making him appear distracted or inattentive in ways misunderstood by others. The officers listened attentively, nodding with empathy and acknowledging the challenges faced by both mother and child, affirming the necessity of patience and compassion in such encounters. Turning their attention to Karen, the officers requested her side of the story, allowing her to recount her experience while maintaining an impartial demeanor. Yet their questions carried an unspoken seriousness that made it clear the situation was far from trivial. Karen, still shaken but determined to defend herself, attempted to justify her actions by emphasizing her perception of being disrespected, describing how she believed the boy was glaring at her with malice and intent to provoke. However, her narrative faltered under the scrutiny of the officers' calm but pointed inquiries, as well as the eyewitness accounts gathered from other shoppers who had witnessed the event unfold. These witnesses described Karen's escalating agitation, her loud accusations directed at the boy, and ultimately the moment she crossed the line by striking a child who was clearly confused and frightened. The mounting evidence painted a picture of a woman whose judgment had been clouded by anger and misperception, leading to a regrettable and unacceptable act. Throughout the questioning, Karen's demeanor shifted subtly, from defensive bravado to an uneasy recognition of the seriousness of her predicament. The officers informed her of the potential charges she faced, including assault and child abuse, emphasizing that hitting a minor was a grave offense in the eyes of the law, regardless of perceived provocation. They explained the legal procedures that would follow, including formal statements, possible court appearances, and the need for restitution or other remedial measures. Karen absorbed this information with a mixture of disbelief and growing apprehension, the consequences crystallizing into a tangible threat that no amount of justification could dismiss. The once confident and indignant woman was now forced to confront the tangible reality of her actions and their impact on a vulnerable child and his family. Meanwhile, the mother continued to care for her son, offering quiet reassurances and explanations to the growing crowd that had gathered, many of whom expressed sympathy and support. She spoke eloquently about the challenges of raising a child with a visual impairment in a world not always built for understanding, highlighting the importance of patience, awareness, and kindness. Her words resonated deeply with those present, shifting the focus from condemnation to education, and inspiring conversations about the need for greater public awareness of disabilities and the need to temper reactions with empathy. Many shoppers shared their own experiences or expressed a newfound commitment to respond more thoughtfully when encountering individuals with special needs, recognizing that what might appear as disrespect or rudeness could often be a symptom of unseen struggles. The grocery store management, having been apprised of the situation, moved swiftly to support the mother and child, offering assistance and ensuring their safety while the police conducted their investigation. They also reviewed security footage of the incident, which corroborated witness statements and provided clear evidence of Karen's aggressive behavior. This footage became a critical piece of the formal complaint and was submitted to the authorities as part of the case file. The management expressed regret over the incident and reaffirmed their commitment to maintaining a safe and respectful environment for all customers, emphasizing that violence, especially against children or vulnerable individuals, would not be tolerated under any circumstances. Their stance further isolated Karen, highlighting the severity of her misconduct and the social consequences she now faced. As the police wrapped up their inquiries, they provided the mother and child with resources and referrals to local support services, recognizing the additional stress and trauma such an incident could inflict. They assured her that the welfare of her son would remain a priority throughout the legal process, and that any necessary protective measures would be in place to prevent further harm. The mother expressed gratitude for the officer's professionalism and empathy, a stark contrast to the turmoil she had endured moments before. The community, meanwhile, began to rally quietly around the family, with some shoppers offering words of encouragement or even volunteering to assist with advocacy and awareness efforts related to disabilities. Karen, left to face the mounting legal and social consequences of her actions, experienced a profound shift in perspective. The once fiery anger that had driven her to lash out was now replaced by a somber introspection and a dawning awareness of how her prejudices, impatience, and lack of understanding had culminated in a moment of unacceptable violence. The experience forced her to confront not only the immediate fallout but also the deeper patterns within herself that had allowed such anger to surface unchecked. The legal process ahead promised to be challenging, but it also offered an opportunity for accountability and, potentially, personal growth. Though the path would be difficult, Karen was confronted with the necessity of changing her approach to conflict, empathy, and the assumptions she made about others. The incident, now firmly lodged in the public consciousness through the statements of witnesses and the involvement of law enforcement, sparked broader conversations beyond the confines of the grocery store. Community forums, social media discussions, and local news outlets began addressing the themes raised by the event: the importance of understanding disabilities, the dangers of snap judgments, and the critical need for patience and kindness in everyday interactions. Advocacy groups used the incident as a case study for promoting disability awareness and educating the public on how to engage respectfully and supportively with individuals who experience the world differently. This collective reflection created a ripple effect of awareness, highlighting how one regrettable moment could catalyze meaningful dialogue and change. As the legal proceedings progressed, Karen faced the consequences outlined by the justice system, including mandatory anger management courses, community service, and restitution to the family. These measures, while punitive, were also designed to encourage rehabilitation and foster a deeper understanding of the impact of her actions. Through these experiences, Karen was gradually introduced to perspectives and realities previously foreign to her, helping to dismantle ingrained prejudices and cultivate empathy. The process was neither easy nor quick, but it marked the beginning of a slow transformation, one where the lessons of a painful mistake became the foundation for becoming a more mindful and compassionate person. In the quiet moments following the upheaval, Karen often reflected on the incident: the child's confused, frightened eyes, the mother's steadfast courage, the collective response of the community. These reflections stirred within her a mix of remorse and hope, a recognition that while the past could not be undone, the future remained hers to shape. The grocery store checkout line, once a scene of conflict and pain, had become a symbol of accountability, learning, and the possibility of redemption. And as life continued around her, Karen's journey toward understanding and change unfolded, reminding all who witnessed it that growth often emerges from the most difficult and humbling experiences. In the days and weeks that followed the incident at the grocery store checkout line, the ramifications of Karen's impulsive and misguided actions unfolded in ways that profoundly reshaped her life, forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths and grapple with the very nature of her own behavior and its consequences. The initial shock and outrage that had filled the aisles gave way to a slower, more reflective process marked by legal proceedings, personal reckonings, and the gradual but painful dismantling of long-held prejudices. Karen found herself navigating a labyrinth of emotions: guilt, shame, fear, and eventually a tentative desire for redemption, as the reality of what she had done settled in with undeniable weight. The slap that had so violently pierced the quiet routine of the grocery store had left an indelible mark not only on the child but also on Karen's own understanding of herself and the world around her. The legal consequences were swift and unequivocal. Karen was formally charged with assault, the gravity of the offense underscored by the vulnerability of the victim, a child who was legally blind and could not defend himself against accusations rooted in misunderstanding and fear. The court proceedings were public, and the media coverage brought the story into the spotlight, framing it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and unchecked anger. The judge, while recognizing the distress Karen had undoubtedly experienced, emphasized that physical violence, especially against children, was unacceptable and that accountability was necessary not only for justice but to uphold the social fabric of empathy and respect. Karen was sentenced to a combination of community service, mandatory counseling focused on anger management and disability awareness, and restitution payments to the family to cover medical and emotional support for the child. Beyond the courtroom, Karen's journey was marked by a slow but meaningful transformation. The counseling sessions forced her to confront the root causes of her anger, exploring how years of impatience, entitlement, and a lack of empathy had culminated in her violent outburst. Through therapy, she was introduced to the realities of living with disabilities, hearing firsthand stories from individuals who struggled to be seen and understood in a world that often responded with judgment and exclusion. These encounters challenged Karen's assumptions and opened her eyes to perspectives she had never before considered, planting seeds of compassion where once there had been only suspicion and intolerance. The process was difficult, filled with moments of resistance and discomfort, but gradually it nurtured within her a deeper awareness and a commitment to change. Meanwhile, the mother and child continued their lives with resilience and courage. The community rallied around them, offering support, resources, and a collective voice to advocate for greater disability awareness and inclusivity. The mother, once shaken by the violence inflicted upon her son, emerged as a powerful advocate, sharing their story to educate others about the challenges faced by visually impaired individuals and the importance of patience and kindness in everyday encounters. The child, surrounded by love and care, began to heal from the trauma, buoyed by the understanding that he was not alone and that many stood with him against injustice. Their story became a catalyst for dialogue and change, inspiring initiatives in schools, workplaces, and public spaces to foster environments where disabilities were recognized, accommodated, and respected. Karen's reflections deepened as she confronted the broader implications of the incident. She came to understand that her actions were symptomatic not just of personal flaws but of societal failures, a culture quick to judge, slow to empathize, and often blind to the struggles of those who differ from the norm. This realization propelled her to engage actively in community efforts aimed at bridging divides and promoting awareness. She volunteered with disability advocacy groups, participated in public forums, and shared her story candidly, acknowledging her mistakes and the lessons learned. Through these efforts, Karen sought not only to atone for the harm she had caused but to become part of a movement toward greater understanding and inclusion. The grocery store itself took steps to prevent similar incidents, implementing staff training on disability sensitivity and conflict de-escalation, improving signage to raise awareness, and fostering an atmosphere of respect and safety for all customers. These institutional changes reflected a growing recognition of the need to create spaces where everyone, regardless of ability or circumstance, could feel valued and protected. The incident served as a powerful reminder that small moments, like a glance in line, could carry profound meaning and that the way society responded to difference was a measure of its humanity. For Karen, the journey from ignorance and anger to awareness and empathy was neither quick nor easy, but it was transformative. The memory of that mid-afternoon confrontation remained vivid, a stark reminder of the consequences of impulsive judgment and the vital importance of restraint and compassion. She learned that respect was not merely a demand but a practice, a choice made in every interaction, especially when challenged by misunderstanding or fear. The child she had hurt was no longer just a figure of her anger but a catalyst for change, a teacher who, without words, had opened her eyes to the world beyond her own narrow perceptions. In the end, the story closed on a note of cautious hope. The scars left by the incident, both visible and invisible, served as reminders of a painful but necessary reckoning. Karen's path forward was one of continued growth, marked by the ongoing effort to dismantle old patterns and build new ones grounded in kindness, patience, and respect. The community's response, blending accountability with support and education, demonstrated the possibility of healing and progress when society chose to embrace empathy over division. And the child, surrounded by those who loved and protected him, stood as a testament to resilience and the enduring power of understanding to transform even the darkest moments into opportunities for light. Karen accuses teen girl of faking a disability for using the elevator. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The shopping mall was bustling with the kind of weekend energy that only the promise of sales and leisure can generate. Families pushed strollers through corridors, teenagers clustered in groups chattering loudly, and the steady hum of footsteps echoed off the tiled floors of the multi-story complex. At the center of this sea of people, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a teenage girl stepping inside with deliberate care. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but behind the surface was a careful calculation. She had to conserve her energy today, no matter how much she wanted to explore the stores and enjoy the day with her friends. The girl, Emily, had long learned the delicate art of navigating a world that often judged her by appearances rather than understanding what lay beneath them. Her heart condition was invisible, a silent weight she bore every day, making even simple tasks like walking across the mall a challenge. This elevator was her small refuge, a necessity to avoid the exhausting strain her body would otherwise endure. As the elevator doors began to close behind her, a sudden figure stepped abruptly into the entrance, forcing the metal doors to hesitate in their descent. The crowd's movement slowed, eyes turning toward the confrontation that was about to unfold. A woman, mid-40s with sharp features and an air of entitlement that seemed to fill the hallway, planted herself firmly in front of the elevator. Her gaze was sharp and accusatory, landing squarely on Emily. "You look fine to me," she snapped loudly, her voice slicing through the background noise as if she wanted to make sure everyone heard. "What are you doing in the elevator? Stop faking it. That thing's for people who actually need it." The scene shifted suddenly from a gentle afternoon to a tense standoff. Emily froze for a heartbeat, surprised not by the confrontation itself, she had endured similar moments before, but by the brazen loudness and public nature of the accusation. Her heart pounded, not only from the shock of being called out but from the physical strain that the stress inevitably caused her body. Her condition didn't come with visible signs. There was no wheelchair, no cane, no obvious limp to explain why she needed to take the elevator. Instead, there was just her, looking like any other teenager on a shopping trip, and the harsh judgment of a stranger who assumed she knew better. The woman, whom Emily soon thought of in her mind simply as Karen, didn't relent. She crossed her arms and held her ground, seemingly convinced that she was performing some public service by policing the elevator's use. "I don't see any disability here," Karen continued, her voice rising as the crowd began to gather, drawn by the drama. "There are people with crutches and wheelchairs who actually need these elevators. You're just lazy or looking for special treatment." Whispers and murmurs rippled through the small crowd, some sympathetic, others uncertain, and a few clearly entertained by the spectacle. A couple of shoppers shifted uneasily, looking away, while a man with a toddler in tow shot Karen a disapproving glance. Despite this, no one immediately stepped forward, and the weight of Karen's accusations hung heavily in the air, like a thick fog that clouded empathy and understanding. Emily's mind raced. She could explain her heart condition, try to make Karen understand that her struggle wasn't visible but no less real. But even as she opened her mouth to speak, the words felt insufficient, inadequate to bridge the gulf of ignorance that seemed so vast. The elevator buttons glowed softly behind Karen, the silent invitation to ascend or descend waiting for release, but Karen blocked it all the same. The tension stretched taut, every second feeling like a test of endurance. Emily's chest tightened, a familiar discomfort signaling that the stress was already impacting her health. Her heart condition was unpredictable, sometimes leaving her dizzy or breathless without warning, and every moment of confrontation was like a storm threatening to break loose inside her. Still, she stood her ground, refusing to retreat. She had come here to enjoy a day like anyone else, and she wasn't going to let this moment define her. From somewhere in the crowd, a young woman cleared her throat and quietly said, "Maybe she has an invisible illness. You can't always tell." The voice was tentative, but it broke through the wall of judgment Karen had built. A few heads nodded, the atmosphere shifting just slightly as awareness began to creep in. Karen shot a glare at the voice but didn't immediately respond. Her lips pressed into a tight line, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed like she might relent. But then she squared her shoulders and said, "Invisible or not, I'm tired of people taking advantage of kindness and special privileges." Emily felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, but she refused to show it. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, knowing that any sign of weakness might be twisted into confirmation of Karen's accusations. "I have a heart condition," she said quietly but firmly, "it's not something you can see. Using the elevator helps me manage my energy and avoid getting sick." Her voice was calm, but her words carried the weight of countless unseen battles. Karen's face twisted into a skeptical frown. "Sure, if you say so," she replied dismissively, as if the very idea was laughable. She glanced at the gathering crowd and smirked, clearly enjoying the attention she was getting. Some people looked away, uncomfortable, while others whispered behind their hands, debating who was right. The mall's noise level returned to a low murmur, but the tension in the small space near the elevator remained thick. Emily's fingers brushed against the edge of her backpack, where she kept a small card from her doctor explaining her condition, a card she rarely needed to show but had brought today just in case. She debated whether to pull it out and prove her case, but the thought of having to prove her legitimacy to a stranger felt humiliating. Instead, she took another breath and looked around, silently hoping someone would step in, not to escalate the argument, but to stand with her in simple humanity. At that moment, footsteps approached rapidly from behind Karen, and a security guard stepped into the scene, his presence breaking the escalating standoff. He looked at Karen with a polite but firm expression, then shifted his gaze to Emily. "Is there a problem here?" he asked calmly. Karen, feeling the sudden scrutiny, stepped aside without another word, muttering under her breath about people taking advantage. The elevator doors closed gently, and Emily pressed the button for the upper floor, her heart still racing but her resolve unbroken. As the elevator ascended, she caught glimpses of the crowd dispersing, some faces filled with sympathy, others still casting skeptical looks. She clutched the railing tightly, the metal cool under her fingers, and allowed herself a moment to feel the weight of what had just happened. Invisible illnesses, she thought, often meant invisible battles, battles for understanding, respect, and simply the right to move through the world without judgment. The elevator doors opened on the next floor, and Emily stepped out, determined to keep living her life on her terms, even if it meant facing Karen and the world's harsh assumptions one day at a time. Emily moved slowly through the brightly lit corridors of the mall, her footsteps measured and careful, each one a silent negotiation with her own body that sometimes felt like a stranger. The incident at the elevator continued to replay in her mind, the harsh words from the woman who had accused her of faking her illness still ringing painfully in her ears. She knew that to most people, she looked perfectly healthy, maybe even more energetic than some teenagers her age, but the truth was far more complicated than appearances suggested. Her heart condition was something she had learned to live with quietly, a hidden burden that shaped every part of her life. It was a constant balancing act, one where she had to weigh her desire to be normal against the limitations her illness imposed, and the judgment she often faced from people who refused to understand what it meant to live with an invisible disease. She found a bench near a cluster of potted plants by a large window overlooking the parking lot and sat down carefully, taking a deep breath as she tried to steady her rapidly beating heart. The sunlight filtered through the glass, casting patterns of light and shadow that danced across the floor and walls, creating a peaceful contrast to the turmoil she felt inside. She pulled her phone from her pocket, scrolling through messages and social media with a practiced detachment, though her mind was elsewhere, lost in memories and the unspoken frustrations of a life lived largely out of sight. Invisible illnesses, she reflected, were a kind of loneliness. Not only did they sap your physical energy, but they often isolated you from the understanding and compassion of others. It was hard for people to believe something was wrong when they couldn't see bruises or scars or other signs of pain. Her thoughts drifted back to the early days after she was diagnosed, a time filled with confusing medical appointments and endless tests that had left her exhausted but determined to keep her life as normal as possible. Her parents had been a steady source of support, helping her learn how to manage symptoms, navigate the unpredictable ups and downs, and most importantly, advocate for herself when the world refused to listen. They had taught her that it was okay to ask for help, even if it meant exposing her vulnerability, and that her worth was not tied to how visible her illness was to others. Still, even with their encouragement, Emily had faced countless moments of disbelief, skepticism, and outright hostility from people who assumed she was exaggerating or looking for an easy way out. As she sat there now, the memories felt both distant and immediate. She remembered a time when she had collapsed at school during gym class, the confusion and panic on the faces of her classmates who thought she was just being lazy or faking it to avoid participation. The nurse had taken her aside, gently explaining that her heart condition made it unsafe for her to push herself too hard, but the damage had been done. Rumors spread quickly in the tight-knit social circles of high school, and it took months for her reputation to recover, if it ever truly did. The invisible nature of her illness meant that empathy was often replaced by suspicion, and she had learned to armor herself against the stings of misunderstanding. The text messages on her phone flickered, pulling her out of her reverie. A message from her mother appeared. "Are you okay? I heard about what happened at the mall. Call me when you can." Emily's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she typed back, her reply short but sincere, "I'm fine. Just tired." She didn't want to worry her parents more than necessary, especially after a long week of managing doctor's appointments and schoolwork. Still, she knew they would want to talk, to hear her side of the story, and maybe offer some comfort that words on a screen couldn't fully convey. Her phone buzzed again almost immediately, this time from her best friend, Mia, who had been with her earlier that day before parting ways to meet up with her own family. Mia's message was filled with support and outrage on Emily's behalf, telling her she shouldn't have to explain or prove anything to anyone. The warmth in Mia's words made Emily smile faintly, reminding her that she wasn't entirely alone in this. Having at least one person who believed her, who understood the invisible struggles she faced, was a lifeline in a world that often felt indifferent or hostile. Despite the comfort of these connections, Emily felt a familiar weight settle over her chest, a mixture of frustration and sadness that she couldn't shake. The world was quick to judge what it could see and reluctant to believe what it couldn't, and she had spent too many years trying to fit into spaces that weren't designed for someone like her. The mall, a place that was supposed to be full of fun and freedom, had become another battleground in her daily fight for acceptance. She thought about the elevator, the small but vital tool she used to protect herself from overexertion, and how that simple choice had become a flashpoint for misunderstanding and cruelty. She recalled the times she had tried to explain her condition to strangers, friends, even acquaintances, only to be met with skepticism or outright dismissal. People wanted proof, a visible sign, something concrete they could understand, and when none was offered, their judgment filled the void. Emily knew it wasn't just ignorance, it was fear and discomfort with the unknown, with things that didn't fit neatly into their expectations of health and ability. This made her cautious about revealing too much, for fear of being labeled a burden or a fraud. The sound of footsteps approaching gently pulled Emily back to the present. It was an elderly woman who stopped nearby, a kind smile on her face as she glanced at Emily with a look of recognition. "You're that young lady from the elevator, aren't you?" she asked softly, as if hesitant to intrude but compelled to offer kindness. Emily nodded, grateful for the gentle interruption. The woman sat down on the bench beside her and reached into her bag, pulling out a small, worn notebook. "I've had my own struggles with invisible illness," she said quietly, "and I just wanted to tell you that you're stronger than you know. Don't let people like that get to you." The exchange was brief but meaningful, a small moment of connection in a world that often felt isolating. Emily found herself opening up slightly, sharing a little about her heart condition and the challenges she faced. The woman listened without judgment, nodding in understanding. It was a reminder that even though her illness was invisible to most, she was not invisible to everyone, and that meant something. After the woman left, Emily stayed on the bench a while longer, reflecting on the unexpected kindness and the strength it gave her to keep going. She thought about the journey ahead, the battles she would face, the judgments she would endure, and the moments of compassion she would hold onto like lifelines. The mall, with all its noise and crowds and distractions, was just one small part of that journey, but it was a reminder that beneath every face was a story that deserved to be heard and believed. With a renewed sense of quiet determination, Emily stood up, feeling the familiar but manageable ache in her chest, and made her way back toward the stores. The day wasn't over yet, and she wasn't going to let one woman's ignorance define her experience. Invisible illness was a silent companion, yes, but it was also a part of her resilience, a testament to the battles she fought every day without complaint or fanfare. As she moved forward, step by careful step, she held on to that truth, that her worth was not measured by what others could see, but by the strength she carried inside. The confrontation at the elevator lingered in Emily's mind like a shadow she couldn't shake, and now, as she prepared herself to face Karen again, the weight of the encounter pressed heavier than ever. When she returned to the same floor where the incident had taken place, the crowded mall had shifted little, families continued to bustle by, teenagers laughed and jostled one another near the food court, and the low hum of background music merged with the constant murmur of shoppers. Yet, despite the noise and movement around her, everything seemed to slow when she spotted Karen standing just a few feet away, arms crossed and eyes fixed on her like a hawk surveying prey. Karen's expression was unreadable at first, but as Emily approached, it morphed into one of stubborn defiance, as if she believed herself to be the arbiter of right and wrong in the use of the mall's elevators. Emily's heart pounded, not from fear but from the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with standing up for herself in a situation where she was so easily misunderstood. She reminded herself to breathe steadily, to keep her voice calm and measured no matter what Karen might say. "I want to explain," Emily began, steady and clear despite the swirling emotions inside her. "I have a heart condition. It's serious, and it's why I need to use the elevator. It's not something you can see, but it's real." She kept her gaze steady, hoping that the words would at least pierce the veil of skepticism that had clouded Karen's expression earlier. Karen narrowed her eyes, her lips pressed into a tight line, and for a moment, it seemed like she was going to dismiss Emily again without listening. "Invisible or not, I've seen people take advantage of these elevators," Karen replied sharply. "I just don't think you're one of those who really need it. You look perfectly fine." The words landed with a sting, not just because they were dismissive but because they revealed how deeply Karen's disbelief was rooted in assumptions about appearance and worthiness. To Karen, it seemed, needing the elevator was a privilege that had to be earned and visibly proven, and Emily, with her quiet dignity and absence of obvious symptoms, was an unconvincing claimant. Emily swallowed hard, the frustration bubbling beneath her surface threatening to break through, but she forced herself to remain composed. "My condition isn't something you can judge by looking at me," she said firmly. "It affects my heart's ability to pump blood properly, which means I can get tired and dizzy very quickly if I exert myself too much. That's why I take the elevator." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small card from her doctor, handing it over with a quiet hope that the medical validation might finally be enough. Karen glanced at it briefly but didn't seem moved by the proof, instead folding her arms tighter as if the card was just another inconvenience. The tension between them grew as a small crowd gathered, drawn by the escalating confrontation. Some people whispered words of support for Emily, while others looked uncertain, caught between discomfort and curiosity. A young man stepped forward, his expression serious, and spoke up in Emily's defense. "People with invisible illnesses face this all the time. You can't always see what someone is going through." His words seemed to shift the atmosphere slightly, as a few heads nodded in agreement, but Karen shot him a cold look and said, "I'm just tired of people using these excuses." It was then that a mall security officer approached, his steps deliberate and his voice calm but authoritative. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, eyeing both women carefully. Karen didn't hide her irritation but stepped back without a word. The officer turned to Emily and asked if she was okay, and she nodded, though the emotional toll of the encounter was evident in the slight trembling of her hands. The officer gave a polite but firm reminder that the elevators were accessible to anyone who needed them, regardless of whether their disability was visible or not. Karen muttered under her breath but didn't challenge him further. As the crowd began to disperse, Emily felt a mixture of relief and lingering hurt. The confrontation had escalated beyond what she had hoped, but she also realized she had stood up for herself in a way she hadn't before, refusing to be silenced or shamed. The presence of supportive bystanders, even if small in number, reminded her that not everyone was quick to judge, and that sometimes standing firm could inspire others to see beyond appearances. Yet, beneath the relief was a tiredness that went deeper than physical exhaustion, a weariness from having to explain and justify her existence in a world that so often demanded visible proof of pain. Walking away from the elevator, Emily found a quieter corner near a bookstore, where the noise of the mall faded into a soft background hum. She sat down and pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages from friends and family who had reached out after hearing about the incident. Their words were filled with concern, encouragement, and offers of support, and she felt a warmth in knowing that she was not alone in this struggle. Mia's messages, in particular, reminded her of the strength found in true friendship, the kind that doesn't question or doubt but simply stands beside you, ready to face whatever challenges arise. Despite the comfort of those connections, Emily knew that encounters like the one with Karen were far from over. Invisible illnesses existed in a world that demanded visibility, where people measured pain and need through physical signs and immediate evidence. The burden of proof was heavy and constant, and the emotional toll of these battles was often invisible even to those closest to her. But as she sat there, catching her breath and gathering her strength, she realized that every confrontation, every moment of being misunderstood, was also an opportunity to educate and challenge the prejudices that so many held. It was a slow, exhausting process, but it was one she was determined to continue. As she looked out the window at the flow of shoppers moving through the mall, Emily thought about the many others who lived with invisible conditions, whose stories were hidden beneath the surface and whose struggles went unseen. She wished there were more moments of understanding, more opportunities for people to recognize that health was not always what met the eye. The kindness of strangers who had spoken up for her today gave her hope, small sparks of empathy in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. Eventually, Emily stood up, feeling the familiar ache in her chest but also a quiet sense of resolve. The mall was still busy, and life moved on around her, indifferent to her private battles, but she carried with her a renewed determination to live authentically and refuse to be defined by others' narrow perceptions. Invisible illnesses might be unseen, but they were no less real, and neither was the courage it took to face the world every day with strength and grace. With steady steps, she moved forward into the crowd once more, ready to navigate the challenges ahead, knowing that she had already taken an important step, standing up not just for herself, but for everyone whose pain and struggle went unnoticed, unheard, and unseen. Emily's footsteps echoed softly as she moved through the crowded mall, the familiar hum of weekend shoppers buzzing around her like a living tide. The confrontation with Karen had settled into a quiet space in her mind, neither forgotten nor fully resolved, but transformed by a deeper understanding of what it meant to live with an invisible illness in a world so often unprepared to see beyond the surface. This time, as she approached the elevator once again, there was no hesitation, only a steady calm that came from knowing her own truth and the quiet courage it took to hold onto it in the face of judgment. The doors slid open smoothly, welcoming her inside, and for a brief moment, the noise and chaos of the mall were left behind, replaced by the soft hum of the elevator's mechanics and the cool, dim interior light. Emily pressed the button for the upper floor and leaned gently against the railing, feeling the subtle vibrations beneath her feet as the elevator began its ascent. Her thoughts drifted to the people she had met that day, the elderly woman who had shared a kind word, the young man who had stood up on her behalf, and even the security guard who had reminded Karen of the mall's policies. These moments of unexpected kindness and solidarity had built a small fortress of hope around her heart, a reminder that she was not alone, even when the world seemed unwilling to understand. As the elevator climbed, the doors suddenly opened again, and to Emily's surprise, Karen was standing there, waiting. Her expression was unreadable, softer somehow, less rigid than before. For a moment, the tension that had defined their earlier encounters hung between them like an unspoken question. Karen looked at Emily not with accusation but with something closer to hesitation, as if the rigid certainty she had carried was starting to crack. Emily met her gaze steadily, silently inviting a conversation that might finally bridge the gap between misunderstanding and empathy. "I'm sorry if I upset you," Emily said quietly, surprising herself with the words. "I know it's hard to understand something you can't see." The vulnerability in her voice was real, a stark contrast to the defensiveness they had both shown before. It was an offering, a gesture of peace that she hoped Karen would accept. Karen's eyes flickered with something unreadable, then she took a slow breath and nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I guess I've never really thought about what it's like to live with something invisible," she admitted, her voice lower and less confrontational. "I just get frustrated because it feels like people use it as an excuse sometimes. But maybe I was wrong to judge you like that." There was a tremor of humility in her tone, a recognition that her assumptions had caused unnecessary pain. The elevator stopped on Emily's floor, and as the doors opened, Karen stepped aside, allowing her to exit first. "Take care of yourself," Karen said softly, the words carrying a sincerity that Emily hadn't expected. For a moment, the world felt different, lighter somehow, as if a small but important barrier had been dismantled. Emily nodded in gratitude, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and cautious hope. Walking through the mall's bustling corridors, Emily felt the familiar flutter of exhaustion but also a growing sense of empowerment. The day had been a series of challenges, from the harsh confrontation to moments of unexpected kindness, and now this quiet reconciliation that neither had anticipated. She knew the road ahead would still be filled with misunderstandings and judgments, but today had shown her that change was possible, even in the smallest interactions. Later that evening, as Emily sat at home with her family gathered around, she shared the story of her day, the confrontation, and the eventual exchange with Karen. Her parents listened intently, their eyes reflecting pride and a deep understanding of the battles she faced every day. Her mother reached over, taking Emily's hand in a gentle squeeze, and her father nodded thoughtfully, reminding her that strength wasn't just about physical endurance but about resilience and compassion as well. Emily's phone buzzed with messages from Mia and others, friends who had rallied around her with words of encouragement and support. She smiled as she read through them, feeling the warmth of connection and the reminder that she was part of a community that saw her, believed her, and stood with her. These were the moments that made the invisible visible, not through medical documents or appearances, but through the bonds of empathy and understanding. As the night deepened and the house grew quiet, Emily reflected on the journey she had taken that day, from the sharp sting of accusation to the unexpected grace of reconciliation. Invisible illnesses, she realized, carried their own kind of visibility, one that could only be revealed through patience, education, and the courage to keep showing up, day after day, despite the doubts and disbelief. It was a slow and often lonely path, but it was also one marked by moments of profound humanity. In the days that followed, Emily noticed subtle changes in the way people around her responded, not just strangers in the mall but classmates and teachers, who began to ask questions and offer help without hesitation. The ripple effect of standing up for herself and sharing her story was quiet but real, a testament to the power of vulnerability and truth. She no longer felt the need to hide her condition or justify her choices. Instead, she carried her invisible illness with a quiet pride, knowing that it was a part of her story, but not the